Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from Kursk, a slice of Russian territory that they had occupied since last year. Ukraine had seized parts of the western Russian region in a surprise incursion and had hoped it would give them leverage in any peace talks. Taking back Kursk have been a key aim for Russian President Vladimir Putin since the Ukrainians launched the operation in August last year. It was embarrassing for him. He was the first Kremlin leader since Stalin to face a large-scale military operation inside his own territory. So, this was really important for him to try to push the Ukrainian forces out. At the time, Kiev touted the push into Russia as a way to boost Ukraine's negotiating position in case of peace talks. Russia threw vast resources into trying to retake Kursk, with analysts estimating that 70,000 soldiers were involved. Despite being a relatively small operation, experts describe it as significant, with both sides suffering losses. Moscow also deployed some of its best units to the region, as well as more than 10,000 North Korean troops. After a while, the size and the mass of the Russian forces began to have an effect. They squeezed the Ukrainians, the area of territory they were holding on to. They wore them down, they ground them down. Eventually, what they managed to do was, quite quickly over the past couple of weeks, they moved to cut off the supply lines to the last troops, which were holding on to the town of Sudzh and other villages around that. And with the supply lines cut off, the Ukrainians were really left with little choice but to retreat. Ukraine's loss of its foothold in Kursk marks a significant defeat for Kiev before Ukraine started this offensive. Partners and Ukrainians wondered whether the Ukrainian military really had the capacity in terms of men and equipment, but also the vigor to mount an offensive operation. And certainly something as unorthodox as an invasion of Russia, the likes of which had not been attempted since World War II. So again, that comes down to morale and to be able to show we're still capable of doing these kinds of operations. Ukraine captured hundreds of prisoners, some of which they were able to swap for their own men who were in Russian captivity, and Ukrainian commanders said they had indications that Russia was planning its own offensive across the border, and so Ukraine's offensive into Kursk prevented that offensive from taking place. So it's hard to judge the success or failure of this operation in terms of taking and holding and then losing this land. Obviously, in the negative column for Ukraine as well is the loss of some of their best troops and some good equipment. They sent some of their best forces, best equipped forces up there, some air assault units. They were among the elite forces of the Ukrainian army. They suffered losses up there, and they were therefore unable to put these guys into the fight elsewhere on the front line. Its rapid retreat from the region followed a pause in U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which came as a result of an Oval Office confrontation between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Your country is in big trouble. I know. Politically speaking, the withdrawal feeds into Washington's narrative of Ukraine potentially negotiating from a position of weakness. One of the reasons why the Ukrainians launched this operation back in August was to show Western partners that they were still in the fight, that they had an army that was still able to conduct offensive operations. Recently, when President Zelensky was in the Oval Office, President Trump said to him, "You don't have the cards." Which leaves one to wonder whether the impression that will be left by this Ukrainian withdrawal from Kursk is that President Zelensky has been left with one fewer card in his hand now, as viewed by West and partners, most importantly the U.S. Some analysts say the pause immediately reduced Ukraine's ability to carry out long-range strikes. In addition, critics of the operation say the incursion had drained resources and manpower from strained parts of the front line. But analysts at Jane's, a defense and security think tank, say that the pause in intelligence sharing is unlikely to have directly resulted in Russia's advances. They say there has been little evidence of heavy fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces over the past week, which indicates that this is likely to have been a planned withdrawal on the Ukrainians' part. The Russians, with their North Korean allies, were already on the front foot in Kursk before the military supplies, and some of the intelligence that the U.S. was providing to Ukraine was paused. So the impact was actually quite small. But I think there's another important point here, which is the effect on the morale that this kind of news coming from Ukraine's most important backer can have. Now morale, of course, is something that's hard to quantify. It's not like we're talking about number of rounds, ammunition, provision of satellite imagery, but it's something that analysts can consistently mention, and you hear it from soldiers on the ground as well as being a big concern, the effect of an unclear level of support from Ukraine's main backer. While it's now been restored, it's unclear how long that's going to be for. Ukraine has had success elsewhere on the front line. It has managed to stall some Russian advances and gained ground in the east. But following high-level talks with U.S. officials in Saudi Arabia, Kyiv says it is ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Russia wouldn't agree to an immediate end to the fighting in Ukraine, adding that any pause in the fighting at this point would only be in Ukraine's favor. Analysts say that Russia has little incentive to stop fighting while it continues to make advances on the battlefield. Russia, from the very beginning of this war that it launched in February 2022, has been quite clear about what it wants. It wants to destroy Ukrainian statehood. It wants Ukraine to be under Russia's control. That means part of its territory being part of Russia. And that means Kyiv controlled politically by Russia. So that is more the bigger issue at stake here. That's much bigger than Kursk. Obviously, it's a blow for Ukraine not to have that as something to bargain with and say they've got that in their hand. It's worth something, but they don't have it anymore. But the military art isn't always about taking and holding land. It can be about different things. It can be about showing allies and showing Ukrainians that you're still in the fight.